Good afternoon, everyone. This is Amanda Ono, VP of People and Culture and Customer Experience with Resolver, coming in from Toronto. Our session today is going to cover a topic I'm really passionate about, which is coaching. The additional layer that we're going to make sure we touch on is, what does this mean in our current state of change and uncertainty? So Justina is going to be helping out with the panel if you have any questions from an IT perspective, and we are of course going to take time at the end for questions, and the slides will be made available. We're going to cover four main areas in this conversation: from evolving your mindset for change leadership, motivating your teams with empathy, and adapting all of these practices for remote work. All of these topics could be, full courses on their own. So I'm going to kind of try to focus on targeted best practices and tactical pieces with the goal of having you leave with some, very practical steps you can apply to your team as soon as possible. So let's dive in. We're in this time of great change and uncertainty. And for many leaders, we're being called to lead from the front, be positive, be supportive, make tough decisions. The list goes on. And this can be a challenge because, truthfully, we don't necessarily know all the answers, and our brains are being flooded with our own stress. And stress can have a negative impact on how we manage. And so if we were to step back from all of this, the framing that I think about is, how do we want to be regarded or remembered as leaders as we move past this pandemic? And it's an interesting way to start the conversation because, as a leader, our actions and reactions and relationships with our employees have very long-lasting impacts. And it kind of reminds me of the famous Maya Angelou quote that I've learned people will forget what you said, will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And so we're going to cover some key topics that will help us with actions that will have an impact of the emotions that we're navigating through in this time of change and uncertainty. And so the first pillar I kind of want to challenge us to think about in working with coaches and executives is to focus on mindset. I think the mindset we hold as coaches and in life really has a big impact in how we engage in relationships, and particularly the relationships with our employees. And part of challenging our mindset, I think, starts with getting out of black and white thinking. And I think sometimes in management, we're schooled to be decisive and to be binary about things sometimes. But what we're really experiencing and finding is a shift towards a little bit more gray in terms of how we lead. And so it's not necessarily an either or situation, there's an and that's involved. And I think we're going to be more likely to balance the tensions in our current work environment if we start to frame it up this way. So let's go through some specific examples. Remote workforce versus displaced workforce. We've been talking about remote workforces, and but for many of us, it was a shift to actually a period of time where we were displaced. We didn't necessarily have the mechanism set up, and for many of our employees, they may find that they still feel displaced. So you can coach them through feeling displaced and be remote. Again, it's not binary, and we have to kind of help move our employees along the continuum. The next thing I think about is change management versus change leadership. And so change management is about processes and mechanisms needed to drive future results. And there's also how we need to think about change leadership, which is really helping our employees with the clarity, communication, and courage they need to move across the line and towards bigger behavior changes. Another pattern I'm seeing is, do we communicate in a more closed fashion or a more open fashion? Our organization at Resolver tends to focus on a very open communication, but the reality is there's always going to be elements we're not able to share. And so with that, I don't think it's all or nothing. I think we can share very key information with employees to help them be successful. And there are some pieces we need to keep confidential. And the final pillar I spend a lot of time thinking about is direction versus empowerment. And I think in this time of change and uncertainty, we need to challenge ourselves to say we can provide direction to our employees that helps them set themselves up for success with a roadmap forward. And in doing so, we can empower them to achieve great results. So again, just some examples of how we maybe need to, think of our behaviors and our actions on a bit more of a continuum of how we move through this. And one framework that's might be pretty helpful to think about is the growth mindset. I'm a huge fan of the work that Dr. Carol Dweck has done in a book called Mindset, The Psychology of Success. And I think it really clearly highlights some key distinctions that help us as coaches so we can move through resilience of this stage. And so, the growth mindset focuses on, how we embrace and invite challenges, whereas a fixed mindset focuses on avoiding challenges. When it comes to obstacles, in a fixed mindset, we give up easily, whereas in a growth mindset, we persist. In a fixed mindset, criticism is discredited or met with defensiveness, and in a growth mindset, we learn to evolve and learn from criticism. And so, like most leaders, we're not perfect. We can't always be in a growth mindset, but thinking about how we move forward and get into the psychology of success, I think is really important during this period of time. And to take a deeper dive into that, the expansion of this mindset is, how we lead with emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is really about how we understand ourselves and are able to understand others to create productive relationships. And there's some great research out there that suggests that all things being equal, it's the emotionally intelligent leader that's going to be more successful. And so during these times of uncertainty, it's a combination of our mindset and self-awareness and ability to interact with others that's going to have a really big impact. And so some questions you might want to challenge yourself with as a coach and a leader. What are the emotions you are experiencing and why? Why are these things happening? And there might be impact on your team, whether you think consciously or unconsciously within them. How are we managing these emotions, particularly in times of stress? Your employees will look to you for behaviors that are deemed appropriate. And so if you are negative and pessimistic, they're likely to follow suit. When we think about the next pillar, which is relationship awareness, again, like how do you recognize emotions in others and lead with empathy? Many believe empathy is a core leadership competency as it impacts how we listen and understand others and really helps us with making balanced decisions. And then finally, a question to ask yourself is, how do you manage and influence others to achieve a positive result? I think relationship management is kind of the culmination of all these other elements of EQ, but it really starts with self-awareness. And how we might dive into that self-awareness is by using a model called perceptual positioning. And I'm a huge fan of this because I think it's very tactical and very easy to apply. And so when we're thinking about leading with more EQ and more empathy, I would challenge yourself to say, how do I see the world? And so this one's usually pretty easy. We know what we think, but I do encourage you to engage in some self-awareness as to why you're thinking about things in a certain way. The second position is how your team member or the other person sees the world. And, for most of us, we start learning these concepts early in life, which is walk a mile in another person's shoes. And so this helps the conversation in our minds with how we can lead with empathy. But I really like this idea of the third position, which is if there's another person observing this interaction, what would they say? And this objective position is a great challenge point because it helps us understand that our behaviors and the behaviors of our employees don't happen in silos, and there's interactivity at play. So this really can help drive empathy because we're challenging ourselves to think of the multiple perspectives that come into play from a coaching perspective. And to take a deep dive on this, I kind of challenge people to say, based on what you've learned in perceptual positioning, how could you reframe your thoughts? And we can do this in a very powerful way using the thought, feeling, action triad, which is used actually in cognitive behavioral psychology, but I think is super valuable in coaching. And to do this, I want you to take a pause and think for a second about a negative situation that you had recently. So perhaps you have one particular employee who's reacting to stress differently than other people on your team. And so as we go through the thought, feeling, action triad, your first thought might be this person is not adjusting the way other team members are, they're not being effective. And as a result of that thought, the feeling is maybe one of frustration. And your actions may be that you're a bit shorter with them than perhaps you would like to be, and maybe you're not giving them the benefit of the doubt. And again, we probably think we mask this better than we do. And so with the information and the insights we've gained from perceptual positioning, maybe you reframe your thought and you say, this person is really stressed. They have two small kids at home, and I can imagine it's extremely difficult to kind of engage and stay on top of work. And so now that you've reframed this thought, your feeling is one of empathy. That's really tough, and this must be challenging. And so your action as a coach might be to help figure out how to remove barriers and offer more flexibility. So again, this is just a quick example, but you can see if you were to go through this that the outcomes for the employee and for you would be significantly different because you're challenging yourself to lead with empathy. And so we're expanding our mindset and being more deliberate about engaging with emotional intelligence. And so how do we turn this into tactical best practices? I'm going to look at two lenses. One is thinking about it from a leadership perspective, which is kind of in the bigger org, and then one from a tactical coaching perspective. And so I really think when it comes to some of these tactical leadership best practices, I strongly believe that fostering engagement with our teams is critical during this time of change. The relationships you have with your employees and your employees have with each other is such a big part of your culture. And in doing this, you can help it be a constant for them, and you can help them find some meaning in a time that feels very uncertain. And so one thing to challenge yourself with is, creating a listening campaign. So, many employers have employee engagement surveys that they do maybe annually or biannually, but can you increase the frequency of this and ask really specific questions about what is happening in your organization so you can create a very quick feedback loop so you can adjust your support strategy. Perhaps you even increase the frequency of town halls or all hands meetings so people can feel connected and engaged. One strategy that we did at Resolver is at our last town hall, we did an anonymous portal with questions so people could just kind of say what was truly on their mind and we could respond to them. But creating the listening campaign so the employees feel they have a voice in this is pretty critical. How do you foster virtual collaboration? I did a webinar a few weeks ago on this, but I certainly think there's some best practices for remote meetings that we need to be really mindful of. A small one I've been thinking about on a tactical perspective is making sure that prep work is available for people, and an agenda is available. And this, really helps foster inclusiveness because your team members that are a little bit more quiet or introverted will be prepared with dialogue to engage with. And so this helps kind of foster that collaboration as you move through a new way of working. The next thing to think about, talent management and learning development, these are, big, massive org-wide initiatives that are typically run by your HR teams. But, one thing that you could think about from a talent management perspective is there a way to leverage existing skills of employees by redeploying them or seconding them to work on special projects that might have a very high value? This is something that we've been doing testing at Resolver, and it's been really effective. So again, these are often big programs, but perhaps you think about how can you do it on a micro level to achieve success. From a learning and development perspective, most of us have a little bit more time on our hands, especially with the commute gone now. So, is there a way you can enable a larger focus on learning and development? And, perhaps as a tactical strategy, you consider as a leader selecting a topic for your team to research and learn about, and you time block it. So you block it in their calendar. You have 2 hours where we want you focused and learning and thinking about these things, and say you do the 2-hour block on a Thursday. And then on the Friday, you regroup as a team for an hour to just talk about what you learned and how you might be able to apply these to the organization. So again, often these are big programs, but how can we distill them down into simple things that we could still achieve success with during this time? Kudos. So I'm a big fan of kudos. It's a giving verbal recognition and recognition to folks. It's a very small gesture, but it goes a long way. And in fact, employees often cite that recognition from a manager is one of the highest impact forms of recognition. And the best part is for all of us who are kind of being a bit more budget conscious is that it's free. And so, I would consider that, you pick an employee a week that you make sure you're thoughtful about with verbal recognition or written recognition. And when you do that, you're going to make sure you're kind of creating this cadence of gratitude that you're moving throughout your team. I would encourage you to be specific. Don't just say great work. Put some thought into it and saying something like, I really appreciate the initiative you've shown over the past 4 weeks. Your work on this project is really going to help foster a great customer experience. That's the kind of kudos and recognition, if I'm applying to employees, is going to make an impact. Next thing I like is organizational problem solving. So, we often solve problems with a specific tier of the organization, but I think we're seeing now that, silos that exist in organizations are being really disrupted. And so, can you pose a big organizational problem and facilitate a conversation with a group of people that aren't the usual suspects to help solve things? So, can you put it out there to ask a question through a facilitated conversation like, how do we better serve our customers? Or what are processes on a team level that need to be improved or are broken that we can fix during this time? And finally, how do we build team engagement? I really recommend, and we're doing this as an organization, is blocking time for socialization. I think it's so critical. We do virtual coffees and lunches and do games nights that are remote. I think there's some wonderful tools out there that really help people still feel connected and have some constancy in the culture as we move through this time. Moving from bigger leadership into coaching, again, whereby I think coaching is how we engage with our direct or even indirect reports on a daily basis. Many of us call it to manage them, which it is, but I like the term coaching because it's about mindset. And I think what we're finding with coaching is that these frameworks have moved from command and control, providing direction, telling employees what to do, and they've been really disrupted or even thrown out the window. So again, I think, excuse me, fostering that mutual accountability to results is so key. And, this is from Kim Scott, who wrote a great book called Radical Candor. But she really talks about the importance of feedback is being able to help people know what success looks like so they can repeat it. And it's not about just making people feel good about themselves. And the second element she thinks about is, how we can help people get better. So not attacking their character or being critical of them, but helping them get better. So I think these are all kind of key best practices as we think about coaching. So with this in mind, how do we approach and engage our employees as coaches? So I think from an overall perspective, many of these are best practices that I think we just need to be a bit more deliberate about during this time and evaluate our own coaching practices. But thinking about our approach, I think coaching is about relationships that are meant to build trust, enable strengths, and remove obstacles. I think another key thing we're hearing is that frequency and consistency of coaching conversations has really increased. I mean, a key tenet of a coaching model is it focuses on frequency, where you engage in conversations that look forward and coach forward versus look backwards. So if you haven't yet, booking those weekly or biweekly calls, I think is so critical, and being consistent about it. Again, I think we have an opportunity to be a constant for our employees as we help them. Being prepared, you probably need to spend almost as much time preparing for your one-on-one as delivering it. And I know that might seem like a lot, but it's really what helps set up very critical conversations where you can create guidance that is actionable. Being present, trying to be distraction free, whether you like it or not. If if your eyes move away from the screen on a video call and you're looking at email or an instant message term, the message that you're sending is what's happening over there is more important than what's happening here. Very key tenet of coaching, especially during this time, is curiosity first. Again, managers typically are developed to make decisive judgments, but sometimes the skill can work against us as it relates to coaching conversations because we could be quick to judge, and in those judgments, we could be interrupting folks. And so I just, challenge you to focus on listening and leading with curiosity. A key element, and again, the thought, feeling, action triad helps us with this, but focusing on the behavior versus the person is so important. So, making a statement like the document needed more research is about behavior. That's something that your employee can change. But saying something like you were lazy with your research is a judgment on their person and their character that might be hard to fix. And finally, engaging in mutual feedback. I think we get the most out of our coaching relationships if we're able to engage in that mutual feedback. And so if you're going to provide feedback, you have to be ready to receive it too. So if you ask for feedback, don't get mad about what you hear, get curious. I know it's easy to feel defensive, we all can. But this feedback is going to help you open your blind spots. And the more self-aware you are, the more you're going to be able to support your coachees as you move through this relationship. And I think, the big thing that we see in terms of coaching in a time of uncertainty is about how do we remove obstacles, whether those are real or perceived. And I think, helping people, move through the fog. So I like this framework of fog. Is that a fact, an opinion, or a guess? And so getting to the bottom of people's perceptions is often how you're able to remove those barriers so they can do their best work. And one thing you're probably going to notice during this time as a coach is that, you're often needing to enable people's strengths by helping them prioritize. And so, since your employees are remote, you may miss the physical cues or quick drive-by coaching moments that happen where you can unblock someone. So, thinking about a practice where you can prioritize and reprioritize to help support them is a really good strategy from a tactical perspective to make sure you are supporting your employees. I often get asked about specific coaching questions, so I just wanted to kind of provide some. In the spirit of empathy, I wanted to call out that it's important to validate our employees by saying things like, I hear you. However, avoid those qualifiers. I like how Brene Brown phrased it. She says, no empathetic statement starts with at least, it erodes empathy. So I hear you, but we need to fix it, or I understand you're stressed, at least we still have jobs. Those are things that might back your employee into a corner. And so some terms that might help us to lead with empathy in this time of uncertainty are things like, I understand there's a challenge. Let's brainstorm some scenarios. What can I do to help? How are we going to take care of this? And of course, when we see things differently, let's try to understand why. So again, just some very tactical statements that help us lead with empathy and, help our employees know that we're going to work alongside them in this time of change. And so the final note I wanted to highlight is self-care. I call this out because as leaders, we are, so tasked to support others. And in the face of change, we are challenged to be the beacon of hope and positivity, but it requires a lot of energy. And I personally found during our initial period of being displaced and then remote, I wrapped the day feeling really tired. And so I would use the analogy of the oxygen mask on first for you as a leader. And I would also say to you, be kind to yourself. Remember, we need to see a bit more gray. It's not as if we're a good leader or a bad leader. It's that we will have good days and we will have bad days. And so we're all human in this. And so focusing on how we can recharge our batteries and be bring our best foot forward, I think is pretty critical. And so just some things for you to kind of keep top of mind is setting your boundaries. Boundaries are about ensuring that you're not working around the clock and you're giving yourself space to recharge. We all have mental and physiological batteries that when they're drained, the extra couple of hours we put into work are probably not that productive. Self-care. I challenge leaders to really think about creating a list of what recharges their batteries. Write those things down because it's very specific to each person. And then do one of those things each day. So it could be exercise. I know I'm doing a lot of my one-on-one calls that don't require a screen as a walk and talk. That's a good strategy for me. It could be meditation and mindfulness. Reflection. I'm a fan of, on a weekly basis, I do a bit of a self-inventory. I kind of ask myself, what I learned and what I think I did well and what I would have done better. And those three questions just help drive self-awareness. And then conversation, I think that's a key self-inventory, self-care inventory item, because you're going to find if you are connecting with your peers, within the organization or particularly without, from outside your organization, you're going to feel that what may seem like a swirl of activities is you're not feeling alone. And so, engaging in those conversations can help you feel re-energized and validated and ready for the next challenge. And then finally, how do we role model? I think this has a really big impact. If you're going to tell your employees to have boundaries and take care of themselves, you need to do the same. So just some things for you to think about to make sure you're recharging your battery along the way. So we went through some best practices from evolving your mindset for change leadership, motivating your teams with empathy, and adapting all of this within a time of change and uncertainty and certainly remote work. And so I would just say in closing, we've really had to change how we work and engage our team members in perhaps more expensive ways. And so I challenge you to think about how you will navigate this time of change and uncertainty with humility and the willingness to learn, our honesty and communication and approach, and our humanity and empathy will go a long way to help people feel positive as we move through this, so we can be remembered as very positive leaders. So, again, how will you navigate with humility, honesty, and humanity? And so ideally, some of these best practices are things that will help you be that constant and help you engage with your employees as coaches to do your best work. Really appreciate your time. If you need to drop off, we appreciate you engaging with the Resolver community. And as I said, the slides will be made available. Otherwise, I'm going to turn the floor for some questions. I will say in closing, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I love hearing what other thought leaders in our Resolver community are up to and how they're doing. So feel free to connect. Really appreciate sharing the time. And on that note, I will flip it over for questions. So a question coming in, do I have a list of the top 3 books I would recommend? And so as a leader, that's a great question. So there's a couple that I think are very strong. So one is called Primal Leadership. It is Primal Leadership is a book by Daniel Goleman, and so he's the person that really kind of brought emotional intelligence as a key framework. And I think that one has had a ton of impact because it's really about that emotional intelligence and empathy. There is a book called Execution. I can't remember the author right now. We can probably look into that, but it's really about being able to be tactical about how we engage with employees. And the framework is kind of that 10% strategy, 90% execution is a key aspect of leadership, which is why I'm such a big fan of coaching, because it's very tactical. And a third one that comes to mind, this is such an oldie but goodie, but I love Good to Great. It's an amazing book because you learn about how companies have challenged themselves to be successful. I probably have lots that I'm missing, but I would be happy to, if you pop me a note on LinkedIn, I can put a little bit more thought into how we might do that. Oh, interesting question. So how about a role-playing game where the C-suite changes with roles in cleaning services or catering so they can realize the importance of that? I love that idea. I think it's a really great strategy to build empathy. This is actually something that the hotel industry often does really well. When you're going through a management training program, you have to kind of shift around and take on different roles in the hotel to learn about each other. I think if your organization is open to doing that, I think that is a really great strategy. There's a question about, will the recording be emailed to us? I believe, Justine, it will be emailed. I think from the perspective of the slides are for sure there. I think the recording will be available as well. And as I said, if you have any kind of tactical questions, or happy to connect with folks on LinkedIn and answer them. I think sharing thought leadership is pretty critical for folks as we move through this time. Okay, so I think that's it for questions, Justina. Again, I really appreciate your time. I'll flip back so my contact information is here for folks. But I would just say that as leaders, we are called to do so much. And I think, with hopefully some practices that you could apply, you will help achieve some success. But I would just say to you, make sure you're taking care of yourself, because I think it's so critical that our batteries are ready to go in this time of change and uncertainty. So thank you again on behalf of myself and Resolver. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe and stay well. Thank you.